So, I love that story.
Thanks.
I thought one of the things that all these stories captured so well is what it feels like to move through the world where you can't picture your future self, you can't imagine your future self for various reasons. In your stories, it seems unimaginable and unattainable. And I love the way you play with this concept of transitioning, including in some very fabulous ways. I think this is sort of a good example where they're picking out objects for things that will have meaning in the next life. So it's like transitioning into another life, transitioning through genders, transitioning out of and into relationships. And the way that sometimes that's presented as like a deconstruction and reconstruction, or in one of your stories, a radical reorganization, in order to get to some inner core or inner truth. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about when that emerged for you. Were you aware of that as a theme? Was it something that just sort of came out from the stories?
I wasn't aware of it as a theme until I started thinking about how to introduce the stories to other people, and then I realized that it wasn't just about a bunch of transitions. But I hadn't thought about it the way you had put it when you said trying to imagine a future and not being able to imagine one. And I think that got me thinking about that maybe it's not just me, but maybe that's a sort of inherently trans perspective when you grow up not knowing that you are a trans person. So I was assigned female at birth, and I grew up as a young woman really close by here in Texas, in Seguin. And my mom is a proper Texan lady. She's wonderful, but she also raised me to be a proper Texan lady. So I was a debutante, and I was I did play sports and things like that, but I was very, very poignantly aware that my mom was teaching me how to be a woman instead of me sort of picking it up from the world around me. She was really teaching me how to be the right kind of woman. And for years I was a little upset about that, because I don't think I was necessarily a woman, but I realize now it was for safety reasons. In such a small town, you can't be different. And so when I was a child trying to imagine who I would be when I grew up, I couldn't. There was just a big sort of, all the possibilities were there, except for I didn't think it was possible to grow up to be a man. That was and maybe like a couple of coaches. Maybe I thought, if I like sports, maybe I could be a coach, like Coach McCauley, because she seemed to have it all and still get to wear flannel. And be accepted in the community, and she had some sort of secret girlfriend in Marble Falls. I don't know. So but growing up not really having an idea about who I could be when all I knew was that I really loved books, but that doesn't translate into a career. I thought that I could maybe be a writer, but I didn't know how. So I didn't really have an idea of what I would transition into, and I had no idea that there was such a thing as testosterone even, or that there were other people like me. So I realized then, right about that time, I started reading the stories by Joyce Carol Oates and Shirley Jackson, and I want to say those two particular writers. Oh, and I ran into Rachel Ingalls at that time. And their stories are, you can sort of walk up with them to a fence, sort of like they let you go so far, and then you have to stop, and you can only kind of look over the fence and see what's over there, but you can't go there. So there's just all this possibility. And I think that translated for me into hope. a type of hope, even though Shirley Jackson's stories are like really full of like sad, hopeless feminists. So I think that, yeah, and those became the kind of stories that I was sort of craving, where like people who are trapped and people who I was just sort of praying for some kind of fissure in the reality that I had, and that's what those stories gave me, was like some fantastic fissures that I could sort of hope for.
I did get that sense so strongly, like this feeling of like really trying to break out, like you're that feeling of being trapped, but not like in a way that's like hopeless actually. But I think in some ways like your fabulous elements sort of help just break open more possibilities there. I actually felt like there was something very liberating about each of these stories. I would love to know when you started writing. How did you get into writing?
I wrote my first book. It was about a purple planet, and I wrote that when I was in like middle school. Yeah. So, and it was also about sort of escaping with the boy that I liked at the time to a planet. Yeah. So I started writing, but I really didn't believe that you could just be a writer. Like I didn't think that was a thing that you could do. And I knew that I wanted to write, but I also knew I wasn't, I wasn't doing the kind of writing that I felt like was going to be published. So it was kind of this, it was kind of a conundrum, because I didn't think that I could make a career out of it, and yet I just like, I was just compelled to do it, And I also didn't think it was good, like I wasn't feeling like people were really waiting for this. And then we were just talking about the MFA program at Texas State, and the MFA program, they were like, no one's waiting for this. Like, good luck to you. So even though I was writing and I felt compelled to write, I didn't think that there was a real place for it until after I got out of my MFA program. Yeah.
Sort of a similar story to my MFA program.
Really?
Well, I wonder if you could like maybe walk us through like one. I just love the creativity of what, and I struggle with short stories. So, I'm always like, what the hell is supposed to happen in a story? So, and you have these stories where these incredible things happen that make total sense in the universe of the story. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where that comes from. Maybe like one particular idea, like there's a story where the young convict has a chance to have all her DNA remixed, right? And to create a whole new person, but some different version. It could be that, or it could be the store, going to pick up objects. But can you talk to us? Can you remember where that germ of the idea came from?
Yes. So for which one did you?
I'm very intrigued by the first one, the DNA,
radical
reorganization.
So that is actually, it's not even going to be a short story. It's actually the third part of my novel. And I didn't realize that. I thought I was writing a short story. So I was stuck in my novel that I'm writing now, which I think is, you're right, it's a completely different process. And I'm finding it difficult to learn that process as I'm going, because in MFA programs, at least mine, they taught you how to write short stories. And you're right, plot is really hard in a short story, especially my inclination is to just write about like sort of people thinking about stuff while they're like doing a dish, and looking out over through the kitchen window or something.
I have a lot of those.
Yeah, me too. And a dog. There's always a dog that comes in. and someone has just died or something. But they're essentially plotless and also not very interesting. So I was thinking, I took a break from the novel and I was like, I'm just going to write something totally different. I'm going to try real sci-fi instead of this other weird stuff that I'm doing. And I thought, I don't know anything about science, so I'm going to do research for the first time. And I heard on the radio, on a podcast, on a radio lab, about how caterpillars, and I hate insects, by the way, I freaking hate them. So just looking at these pictures was horrible. But how caterpillars will, when they cocoon up, before they become a butterfly, everything but the lungs and the nervous system, I think, just sort of becomes this primordial goo, and then it reforms itself into this really beautiful butterfly. So I thought, wouldn't it be great if people could do that? And wouldn't it be great if we could take trans people and give them another shot? So it would be great if I could go back to my puberty and just do it right the first time and not have to worry about, all the other stuff that all the confusing, terrible, buying a bra and stuff like that. So I thought it would be wonderful if there was a pod, and people went into the pod and could sort of be transferred down to this primordial goo, remix the DNA from your parents and just try it again. And then what if maybe you came out a different gender or a different biological sex or whatever the Republicans want to call it. So what if that happened? And so then I made up that particular story. And it took me a long time and a long time to figure out who I wanted to go into the pod. And I figured that a murderer would be great. Because as a first person, they would want to try it out on someone that they didn't think mattered, So I set it in the near future, and made it about a queer woman who had murdered her parents and had become kind of a celebrity by doing that. And they didn't put her in jail necessarily, but they put a tracker on her head and just kind of let her go and let people film her and make fun of her, throw things at her, just do whatever they wanted to do instead of sending her to jail, because it made for great TV and good ad sales. And so when this is happening in her life, then a man comes up and offers to do this genetic transformation for her. So in that way, I could explore kind of the possibility of what would happen when, if she was able to come out a completely different person.
Yeah, that's so great. So, in any sort of liberation movement or, social justice movement, language is, and, there's always this transformation of language and naming, there's in the Black liberation movement, Black power and Black is beautiful. And then, that's no less true of the queer movement or movement for transgender people. And it seems like writers have a special role to play in that, because that's what we do. We work with language. So as a writer, I guess a general question is how important do you think writers are in these movements and in sort of transforming the culture overall? And do you take it on as a responsibility, or do you kind of keep it in the background, or is it just who you are? Do you have that's sort of a hard question. Maybe it's not easy to pinpoint.
I think it's about responsibility, right, to the community that you feel most in tune with. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and I guess in some ways, honoring the community that you know, you do feel in tune with, or the people you're writing about, but also sort of educating, teaching people who don't necessarily have that experience, you know, just about, you know, on a very basic level, how to listen to those stories or how to talk about those experiences.
Yeah, I think that because this movement has just sort of, I mean, it's not brand new, you know, but just in the past 10 years, transgender people have been able to sort of move away from being this underground community, protecting each other for safety reasons, and become more of a movement who's been able to demand civil rights. I think there's been a lot of backlash and violence because of that, but there's also been a lot of growth and movement. And so a lot of times I get asked questions, especially by people who want to be allies but also just do not understand what the hell. Sometimes I get that. I look back at my life and I think, would I get this if I were going through it? Like, what if I was my aunt? You know? So a therapist asked me one time, like, why does the queer community have so many labels, and why has it exploded all of a sudden? Why can't you just be who you are? Be who you are. And so I think that we have a responsibility to help to create a new language for a new community. So I see that happening in a lot of different places, and I think it's because of the internet, frankly, because we can find each other, first of all, and different communities that need each other, that have always just sort of like glommed onto other communities. Like, I'll just glom onto, you know, another oppressed community because we're all sort of fighting for the same thing here in Seguin, Texas, right? You can find each other, and when communities begin to find each other and gain strength from each other, we find that we're diverse and that we all have different backgrounds, and so we need to evolve language to communicate those things to each other. And so the reason I can't just be who I am is because what I am has always been someone else's word for who I am. And I think that, that's something that the trans community shares with a lot of communities who have been historically oppressed, and that the people in power get to name you like you're an animal, and then they get to use that name however they want. And so we get to name ourselves finally. So I've had like I've identified as like 5 or 6 different things, each time getting a little closer to the truth of who I really am. So first I was just FTM, which is like female to male transsexual, but that didn't feel right because I spent 35 years as a woman, and I mean, I feel like that's a big part of my life, and I don't feel like it's something I want to erase. So then I was genderqueer for a while, and that was trans with a little asterisk. Like, ask me later. Which doesn't make any sense. And then and now finally I'm non-binary, which speaks volumes, which just is, I might look a certain way, but my past doesn't match with the way that I look, and I'm not willing to let my past go. So as the language evolves, I feel like we become more and more, or we get closer and closer to the truth of the situation, of everyone's situation. And as we become more diverse and inclusive, then more and more people are able to understand the reality. And I think that my job as a writer is to sort of capture where we are right now and then let it evolve. So there's a real kind of slam in the trans community online, and I'm seeing it at my school too. It's very strange among our sweet little queer kids. There's just there's a real tendency to be gatekeepers about, like, you belong in this queer community and you don't belong in this queer community, and you know, I don't accept your identity as valid, but I do accept these other people's identity as valid. And I think my job as a writer is to pay attention to that and refuse it, you know.
Gender pronouns. I used to get really confused with my mom in English when constantly mix up he and she.
Uh-huh.
I was like, why can't she get this right? And then I realized, in Bengali, there's one pronoun that applies to, both genders or every gender. And it just kind of makes me think about, not that there's like massive gender oppression in India and in Bangladesh. We were all one state at one time, but it just makes me kind of think about what gender means, like what, and I think that it's been interesting to have these discussions about gender and what it means and, why it is so much more fluid than, when I grew up. We were locked into certain stereotypes and expectations of if you're a girl, this is what you do. If you're a boy, this is what you do. And if you don't fit into those, you're gonna get shit for it. What was my question about this? I guess maybe I don't have a question. Maybe I guess I just wanted to
Isn't that shitty?
think about like what, how do we break out of these this rigidly prescribed gender roles and definitions of gender? And I think having a social movement is one part. Having people who are really willing to tear at the edges of that, and I think culture is important. I think writing and art and culture. Do you want to say anything about this, or just
about gender and its validity?
Yes. What does gender mean?
That's a great question. I think that we will both be paid a lot of money if we can answer this question. I hope this, it's being filmed, so maybe we'll solve the problem. I don't know. I think that in America, I think that gender is tied to genitalia, and I think that that's part of what the fight is for those two things to be sort of unhooked. But I think because of the way that America has been set up with just the ideas of coverture and the ideas of women being the property of the men that they marry, in the very beginning, like when we were setting up the country, women being property, I just feel like there's too much to lose by unhooking those two things. Because what would it mean, like, if you couldn't, like, there's a woman walking up, what would it mean if, like, you didn't know if she actually had a vagina? Or if there's a man walking up, what would it mean if you didn't know that he actually had a penis? If those things were unhooked or not tied together anymore, then I think that there's just too much to lose for the people in power. For especially like the white men who have always been able to own the land, who have always been able to own slaves, have always been able to vote, have always been able to make the rules and make the laws and be elected to office and have a political voice. There's just too much to lose for them in separating masculinity and femininity from genitalia. And I think that's why there's this real move, from the administration right now to define biological sex with like genetic testing, which is just like it's not a real thing. Biological sex and genetic testing, the conclusions that people will actually get from that kind of genetic testing are going to be more. They're going to freak out a lot of people who think that they're cisgendered, because a lot of people don't have XY or XX chromosomes. Like 1 in 100 people are born with bodies who are that are different from a standard male or female. So I think that that's why there's this move back to create gender and biological sex to create a parallel between those two things.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, like this like violent reassertion of patriarchy under this, this whole like fascist movement, but this regime of, and so recently the Department of Health and I can't remember which department, there was a memo they put out that said that gender would be defined as your an immutable biological construct that, not a construct, a reality that is determined at birth. While you talked a little bit about what that means for people right now, I read a essay recently which I sort of emailed you about, where somebody from the transgender community, and you hear this in a lot of communities when you go like to a protest or something, and they say, look, there are a lot of people who are under attack right now. And you kind of hear this message like, well, we will survive, we've survived worse than this, which may or may not be true in different cases, but we will survive, and we're strong. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts about that that narrative of just like your strength and resilience is gonna get you through some. This is like actually, I mean, for a while now, transgender people have been fighting for their lives, right? There's the rate of hate crimes against them is very high. So what should everyone who cares about transgender people do? I mean, I guess maybe we can talk a little bit about allyship and, with this, what's coming down with what actually this administration wants to do, wants to institute and put forward erasing transgender people. What do you think the response needs to be to protect transgender people?
Well, I think definitely that we're entering into a time period that is different than other time periods. I keep asking like everybody who I know who's over 60, is this what it felt like in the Cold War? Is this what it felt like? Have things ever been this weird or bad or strange? Have you ever been this sort of afraid for the country? Have things ever felt like this? I just get varying answers depending on how freaked out they were by like the Cold War and all those school drills they had to do for nuclear fallout, which we just had our first our first training for active shooter training, like what do you do in an active shooter at the school where I teach what you do in a situation like that, and it's stuff like, grab the guy's gun, go at him. It's no longer just hide and try to get away. I mean, there's that, but then there's also like pick up a stapler and throw it at him.
What?
So seriously, it was so surreal. So I think that we're in a different place than we ever have been. And like I said, I think that the transgender community, where a lot of us are out and a lot of us are living our authentic lives or whatever, but you're right, the violence against transgender folks, especially trans women of color, is just, it's baffling. So the reported cases, last year we had 28 reported cases of violence against, murderous violence against trans people, and the majority of those people were trans women of color. This year we're right on track to beat that. We're at 22, and it's only November. So it was 17 in July. So, and that's just the reported cases. Of course, there are probably a ton of them. So I feel like with any kind of upsurgence, there's going to be also an upsurgence of violence against people who are challenging not only like patriarchy, but also just like religion. Like I had a couple of aunts, I just got married last weekend, who just wouldn't come to my wedding because even though they've known my partner for 14 years, and we've raised 2 kids together, we've been at every Christmas, they love Bianca, they love the boys, but they wouldn't come to our wedding because they're Catholic. So we're not only challenging just civil rights stuff, we're also challenging a lot of religious stuff. I think that we're entering into a new territory, and I don't know. I don't tend to be super optimistic. I think I think that it will be slow if we do get the rights that we need, but I also feel like there's going to be there's a big battle that's coming, especially now that Trump has been sort of like, now that the midterms are over and Trump is really mad. I mean, he's always mad, but now he's like,
Lashing out.
now he's really lashing out. And when he calls for more violence against immigrants, more violence happens to immigrants. When he calls for more violence against people of color, those instances go up. When he calls for more violence against trans people, when he tries to eradicate us from the army, people's lives get lost along the way. And suicide rates are way up among trans people. Because if you can't see a way forward, if you can't see a way forward, and if you feel like you're going to get killed anyway, then you might as well just, sorry, that sounds really terrible, but I can understand why suicide rates are up, especially for people who can't hide. A lot of people can pass. I now pass as a white cis male, which makes my life like a shit ton easier outside moving through the world, but a lot of people don't, So I don't know what's coming, and I'm frightened, but I think also part of your question was like, what about people joining together? People who are receiving that message, we don't want you here, and I think that's, it's kind of like, it's death by like 1,000 paper cuts, which is like just going to make it really, really hard for trans people to travel. Just going to make it really, really hard for them to get a job. Make it really hard for them to find good housing. All right, we're just going to make it really hard for immigrants to feel safe. Make it really hard for immigrants to get here. We're going to send military out. We might not kill them, but we also might. So I think that those kinds of things take their toll, and I think it's important that we recognize that in each other.
Yeah, I do think that we need, and you see some of this, just this fighting spirit. Like, we're not going to take this, and it's not, not just the people who are targeted, but I love it when somebody gets harassed in a restaurant.
Because you're like up in their faces.
Up in their faces. They should be uncomfortable with what they're doing, and also just like, in South Korea, they had a candlelight revolution, like millions of people in the streets demanding that their corrupt president leave office, and they succeeded. And I don't think there's really a more dangerous person on the planet right now than Trump.
Yeah.
So I think we need to do that here. So anyway, I'll get off my soapbox. I have one more question, then I'm going to open it up to the...
I will come to your candlelight.
Okay, good. So in an interview in American Short Fiction, you talked a little bit about identity and who gets to tell stories. And this is on every, at least I think every fiction writer's mind. And I think it's something that a lot of us are thinking about, but I feel that the debate or the discussion about it is pretty limited. You talked about, I think it was from the story that you read, that a friend who is a trans woman felt uncomfortable with you telling, and maybe I may be mischaracterizing, but
She just said that's the worst thing I've ever read.
Okay, that's okay.
In a nice way.
And it made you sort of question whether you have the right to tell that story. And so I think about this a lot. And I'm often thinking like, okay, what was the problem that people identified, which I think was identified correctly, which is that for centuries, colonial white men, patriarchal men, told stories for women, they decided what stories got told. And other voices were not allowed to tell stories, and sort of like, we define you, we name you. And in response to that, there needed to be a shift. But it seems like some of the response to me is turning stories into commodities. Like, this is my experience, this is my story, and I own it, and you don't get to do anything with it. And I think that actually devalues stories, and I think that it, also just, one, limits our job as writers, which is to be expansive. I don't see how we can actually capture the complexity of the world if our subject matter is narrowly defined by anything, whether by a colonial, guy, or like by, a certain, like, literary movement or something. So, where are you in this question now?
Yeah, I'd like to hear more from you two, just about what the kind of the process is for you, because for me, when I wrote that story about the transgender woman, the one that I read a bit of, it's from a few years back, and I was still in a space as a writer where I was less, I wasn't passing, I was just a visibly queer kind of butch woman walking through the streets and feeling unsafe all the time. And when I walked around that way, men either sneered at me or paid no attention to me, like I was invisible, and women were, they were okay or whatever. And now that I'm a passing, I pass as a white cis man, I mean, men are my friends. They call me bro and boss all the time. Right? They call me they call me boss. That's the weirdest one. And men are really friendly to me, and sometimes women will even touch me, which is weird, because I never grew up thinking that was appropriate. So I was in a completely different space when I was writing that, and there's an instance of violence that's kind of at the center of that particular story against a trans woman. And so I was talking with my partner about this, and she was talking about thinking about it as punching up or punching down. So as I am now, with the kind of privilege that I enjoy, am I punching up or punching down when I'm writing? Am I writing a trans woman's violent story, and am I benefiting from that? Is that different now than it was when I first wrote the story, when I walked around feeling unsafe all the time and getting harassed in bathrooms, 80% of the time? So, and it's less about now I'm thinking it's less about maybe who's telling the story or whose story is it, and more about now that has this privilege changed me? Has it changed the way that I move around this world? I certainly feel more safe. I'm certainly walking around parking garages like a boss, trying to come at me. Sure, sometimes when I get called fag on the street, I'm like, okay, that's okay. It's a different kind of, at least they still think I'm a guy, right? At least there's less of a chance of me being violently attacked. Maybe, I don't know. Anyway, so now I'm thinking of it more in terms of what my partner said about, thinking about it in terms of why do I feel the need to tell this story from this perspective? And is my time better spent reading actual people who have been through that perspective? Is my time better spent, or why is it that I want to write from this perspective? And is it going to put something out into the world that is going to be something that that is going to make it a better place? And if not, should I write the story?
I mean, I think those questions are valid questions. I do think that people should ask themselves those questions, like why, why this character? Why does it need to be this particular identity? And maybe there's a valid reason, maybe there isn't. I guess there's two things for me. Like, one is, how do we get out of this scarcity mentality? I think there's like two different things. One is, we need a flourishing of stories from everybody, from all kinds of people, and we're not in a society that actually like allows all these stories, in this like capitalist publishing system. It doesn't allow all these stories to flourish, so that's a thing. We need to do that. And then there's the question of like, what is the objective effect of the art that someone is producing? And I had this from a sort of different perspective recently, where I was supposed to capture a voice. I was kind of doing an exercise capturing a voice, and I've been thinking a lot about like, how does somebody like Dinesh D'Souza, Dinesh D'Souza, he's this like horrible, like just rabid racist South Asian guy, and I'm like, how does somebody like that become that person? And I started like doing all this reading, and he is so much worse than, like, if you actually read what he actually says. I mean, if this guy could bring back slavery tomorrow, I think he would, like it's so like I don't understand it. And for me, I was like, okay, what if I like try to write a story from like somebody like that? And I sort of wrote this story that I liked, actually. Like, it wasn't like making him into a sympathetic person. It was just sort of like trying to get into this logic. But then when I imagined it out in the world, I was like, this is not, I don't think people can interpret this in a good way right now. So I think those questions.
You thought that it would cause harm, or?
I think it would cause harm, yeah.
Okay.
It's because I'm like, in order to really capture his voice, I had to repeat, I had to like encapsulate some things that he actually believes, and then I was like, I don't want to do that. But, but I don't think that the story itself was bad, I think if it was like, a different, where if there weren't like all these white supremacists out right now that actually do read some of them, but so I do think about that. And the identity of my characters, I sort of got around by just making up places where, and you don't. I think I've sort of, I'm not saying there's any easy answers. I just think, I have questions about it, so it's like good to hear different people's perspectives about it. And I do think that, there are certain stories that I don't feel comfortable telling. They're not really, I don't feel like I can tell it better than somebody from that group. Actually, my first novel that I worked on was about a like 60s rock star and his biracial daughter. And then after a while, I was like, I don't know shit about these people. Like, what am I doing? I should just stop, and I did. So, I think we do think about those. I'm not saying it's like you just write. Everybody write what they want. But I think it's good to talk about it. So. Well, I'd like to open it up thank you for listening to us for a long time. And thank you. I asked like these muddled questions and I got like these gems back. So thank you very much.
You said the questions beforehand.
Yeah. If you have a question, you can raise your hand or just shout it out.
Like the beginning when you're talking about not knowing your future self when you were an adolescent in small town Texas, and I wondered now that you are kind of this future self that you didn't know you would become, what advice would you give to the adolescent self?
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Maybe don't be a debutante. That's a bad plan. Gosh, I don't know. I am a little bit obsessed with the idea of going back and taking care of a smaller me, but I don't know, but I never think about it advice because, you know, I read something, and I'm not going to attribute it to the right person, but they were like, when you grow up without choices, you don't have regrets because there's no way for you to have made a different choice because you don't have choices. So like, because of violence, because of poverty, because of some kind of oppressive system, so like, I don't know what I would have done different, and I don't know how I would have told myself to get through. But I do have these, and sometimes like even dreams where like I go back and I'm just a presence in a smaller me's life, like a presence. Like there is a future, and and I can take care of myself when I'm smaller. But like I just feel like I was just doing what I had to do to survive. I was wearing the dresses, and I was keenly aware of the violence that came against queer people in a mostly white, mostly Christian, Protestant town that was very small. I saw my friends getting beat up or ostracized, and I just made up my mind that I would never be me. So I kind of feel like I didn't have many choices. I don't know what kind of advice I would have given myself, except for you don't have to be a nun, because I thought for a couple of years that's what I would do. But yeah, I think I would have liked to have had a presence of like a happy, healthy, queer, older, non-binary, kind of androgynous person I just would have wanted an example, you know. So maybe that's the advice I would have given myself, like, you're gonna become something worth being, or something. Sorry.
No, good.
Yes, I do follow other trans writers. I really like the work of Ray Spoon and Ivan Coyote. They're actually people who are up in Canada. And they're both musicians, storytellers, and also really good novelists and memoirists. And I love what they're doing with sort of they're mixing genre in their books and also their stage shows. And I just love watching what they're doing. And they're doing a lot of, like they'll go and they'll speak at a bunch of different schools to a bunch of different people, and then they'll come back and they'll sort of write about those experiences out in, you know, the Canadian Badlands or whatever. And so I'm really enjoying them. And then there is a woman, her last name is Nevada. I'm forgetting her first name right now. And there's another woman named Raiko Aoki who I really like, and she's a poet and also a novelist. So I'm forgetting what I'm sorry. But Raiko Aoki is someone who I've been following for quite some time, and I would and I believe she's also a musician. So she's doing poetry and writing novels, and then also she's got some stage stuff. And I think that she's doing really important work that is like way different than, or like pushing boundaries of genre way in a different way than a lot of us are. And as far as memoir goes, I've had a really hard time writing about. I've had even an essay that I would love to write about all my names that I've been working on for a couple of years. I open it every once in a while, and I think I just have a hard time writing nonfiction. So I'm just working on a novel. Been working on it for about 5 or 6 years, and maybe one day it'll be finished. But I'm also not one of those writers who like can only write about other people. I think most of my characters are just like me. Me at a different time in my life, or so thank you.
So I was going to ask you, a lot of your work and your stories have this sort of fantastical element to them. And has that always been a part of your writing, or has that been since you've been through this change within your physical self, and that was sort of a fantastical transformation?
Well, once I got out, like in my MFA program, they tried really hard to tell me that none of that was valid, and so I believed them for a good long time. But I think I started writing sort of fantastic stuff. I really love fantastic stuff that's not just all like new world building. I like science fiction and I like fantasy, but I don't like the high fantasy or the hard science fiction as much as I like like Octavia Butler's stories are some of my favorite stories ever, because they take place in a real place, and then but weird shit's happening too. And so so I think I was always attracted to and drawn to those kinds of stories and those kinds of movies, but when I was writing like seriously for my program, I was writing more realistic stuff. And I learned a lot. I'm not saying that that was a bad thing. It's just that when I left there, then I was like, well, nobody makes a living at this anyway, so I'll just write what I want. Yeah. So, and also like transitioning also gave me kind of a fuck it attitude too, because I also figured
but
like
did that
people don't
feel
care
like,
about trans writers either. So
did that feel like a fantastical element when you were going through that? Did you feel like you experienced that more on the page, or was that before?
Oh, yeah. In real life, it's a real like it definitely messes with my head. So, yeah, I think it probably came out on the page a lot. Like the actual transition. My transition was very slow, over 10 years. So it wasn't until maybe 2 years ago that I was really passing as the way that I pass now, or not passing, but like I look the way that I look now. So yeah, I think probably it came out on the page. That's a good question.
There's a story in your book, the field trip, and it has just like there's just one thing that's really slight, like really weird, but it's completely like familiar space, and like even the whole thing of I was a teacher, so taking us on a field trip, and I just love that story. Like that one thing that you put in there that makes you like stop and say, oh my gosh, what is this? What's going on? It actually like kind of makes you look at your surroundings in a whole different way, and so I really appreciate that too, like fabulous stuff that's not a whole new world, but actually like it's this ordinary place where you live, and then weird shit goes down. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. I've had jaded creative writing professors as well, and jaded critics, so take this question as you will. What do you think was your favorite thing to write, and you read it later and you were like, I nailed it?
Oh, cool.
I don't care what anyone tells you, but like some people say, well, it's a whole collection. And
yeah.
All right, fine. But as a writer, sometimes you feel like you've really captured what you wanted to say, and I'm always interested to know what the author's piece was that they really felt they captured what they were really trying to say, and they just read it back and it sounded right, just 100%, or at least 99,
Yeah, I would say the first story that I ever wrote that I felt that way about, I think it sticks out the most to me, and that's the story in here called Troglodytes. And that's when I knew I'd written a real story, as opposed to like someone washing dishes at a sink. And every time I go back and I read it now, I think that's exactly what I wanted to write. Yeah.
That's great.
What about you? Do you have anything like that?
I do. I have this piece that I wrote, and I had a creative writing teacher, and she was so friendly up in the class, like up in the classroom, and so I like writing poetry, right? And I was like, hey, would you like be my mentor? And she was super frigid about it. And I was like, what happened to the lovely person that was in front of the classroom?
It's not for you.
Yeah, but I wrote this poem after that class, so maybe all the stuff I took her before her class was crap, and then afterwards it just was beautiful, so thank you to that professor. But yeah, I wrote this poem, and I was like in a real troubled place, you know, and yeah, I just, every time I reread it, even now, I'm just like, dang, that came out of me?
Yeah. Right, and I think that's the thing that keeps me writing, is like, I don't get that feeling about everything or anything really half the time. But like, sometimes you just know, like, even if nobody likes this is what I was meant to write, and I nailed it, and it doesn't matter if it gets published or whatever. Like, it's great if people like it, or if they don't like it, that's fine. Like, I did that. And I would read that, you know, so I think that's why people write, you know. Thanks.
Could you tell us a little bit about your writing routine? I know you're working, you have a family. How do you put writing in, and how do you fit it in within your busy life? And
Well, I didn't until I joined Kirk's workshop, and that's Kirk right over there, and Kirk has this workshop, and like that, it makes me privilege writing just as much as I would privilege grading my students' papers, and maybe a little bit more over doing the dishes. Like, writing gets a little bit more privilege than that. Yeah, so like, I have book time in my life, and now that my kids are older, when my kids were younger, I just couldn't. I just didn't have the energy, and I didn't have the time. And I know that people say that you have to make the time, but when you have young kids, you can't make any time. You can't do anything but like clean up vomit for like weeks on end, and try to get sleep when you can, you know. So now that my kids are older, I dedicate like, it's usually from 10 to 12 at night. I dedicate to this book time, and that is like either trying to promote this book, or apply for residencies, write, read other people's writing, like in the workshop. So usually it's like, that's generally like, that's my best time to be alive. It's from 10 to 12 at night, and usually that's when I do it. And then sometimes on Sunday mornings, I can grab a Sunday morning and I can get in like 4 or 5 hours. But for the most part, you know, now that my kids are grown, I can put time into that. And I just do a lot of scheduling, you know. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely the workshop. When I was out of the workshop, I wouldn't make myself take the time. And I think it's like, there's a real camaraderie in the workshop, and like a real responsibility that I feel to put real work into it, so that people aren't reading shit of mine, and so that I'm not giving crap comments to them. You know what I mean? So yeah, so it's all because of Kirk.
Yay, Kirk.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Jack.
Thank you
This
so
was
much.
a pleasure.
It was really fun.
It was really have fun. And if you don't have Jack's book, go get it right now. If you already have it, go get another copy to give to, you know, the holidays are coming up and everything. And also look around. Thank you to
Yeah.
Malvern.
There's a really, Paul Lisicky's book is over there.
Oh, yes.
It's really good.
And you mentioned the importance
Oh,
of Octavia Butler.
yes,
This is
Octavia
why,
Butler.
Malvern, you're not
So
going to get
good.
this kind of service at book people. This is
Those
Yeah.
stories are gonna blow your mind.
When you were talking about the doing science research for
Uh-huh.
the first time, I immediately thought of the title story. And
Yes.
that's because that literally, as I'm sure you know, just
Mhm.
came from ew, botflies are
Gross.
disgusting.
Yes.
And then one of the best short stories.
Here
in
we
the
have
world.
our botfly.
Yeah.
Gross.
right.
right,
Thank
thanks
you,
y'all.
everybody.